All right, everybody. Well, we've been looking at Psalm 96, and hopefully you've enjoyed the songs that we've heard so far. We'll have another one coming up in a little while, but right now, a great opportunity to sit down with Ruth Hettler, who comes to us from Rwanda. Ruth, just give us a little idea of who you are, about your family, and what you're doing in another part of the world.
Yeah, thanks, Earl. Good to be with you today. I was just thinking it's just started to rain out here,
All
so
right.
I hope my internet connection like
See
stands.
how we get
But
on.
but yeah, so I'm Ruth. I'm married to Paul, who's a Canadian, and we've got four children. Our eldest is just almost 13, called Micah. Then Lucy's 11, Joel has just turned 10, and Sophie is 7. And we have been living here in Rwanda for almost 5 years. Well, it'll be 5 years in January. And really, what brought us here was a journey, and a long journey, and a process of really feeling like God was speaking to us about going and overseas, and kind of wrestling with the where that was,
Mm,
and catching a glimpse through conversation with people, really catching a glimpse of what seemed to be happening on the continent of Africa, which was really seeing church rich nations, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, engaging with cross-cultural mission and starting to train and send workers to go to less reached and less engaged areas of Africa. So that's why we're here, is to really walk alongside and journey, especially with young people or graduate students who are feeling and sensing a call like from God to go. And the great thing about Rwanda is you can journey by bus to places like South Sudan, northern Kenya, northern
right.
Tanzania, that really are areas that need to see the kingdom of God come in its fullness. So yeah, it's exciting. It's also sometimes mundane and very ordinary, but great to be just joining in the conversation of what's happening here in Rwanda.
Sounds amazing. So it's a little bit of turning what people might think of missions work on its head. Rather than you doing it, you're actually helping the people that are there extend out from where they are
Yeah,
and to grow.
100%. And that's the pattern of what across the world, if you look at
Mhm.
global mission, is really happening. Like nations like Brazil is one of the
Yeah, sure.
largest sending nations. Ethiopia, Kenya, really starting to send Kenyans and Ethiopians. And the reality is, the world, like we're seeing, right, with the refugee crisis and migrants, like the world is moving, people are moving, and it's no longer anymore about the West sending
Yeah,
workers. It's about all people going to all people.
yeah, that's wonderful. What? It's an unintended segue into Psalm 96, actually,
Mhm.
because in our passage, David, well, we assume it's David, because this is also found in Chronicles, is talking about worship mostly, and he uses the word declare and ascribe and worship and sing, and it begins about the people of God, and then it morphs into the nations and the world,
Mm,
which is what you're talking about. The world has become so much smaller, hasn't it?
mm,
Um,
mm,
but going and easier to go and to go. But it's
mm,
really focused around worship and around the Lord and singing Him a new song. I guess I just wondered, when we think of that word worship, what comes to mind? Because I think
mm,
for some of us, maybe just singing comes to mind,
mm,
and that's
mm,
where it ends. But
mm,
surely it's wider than that, and it's bigger
mm.
than that. So just interested to know what your perspective on that term worship, ascribe, whatever word you want to use,
Mm.
what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think for me, when you ask me that question, the what comes to my mind is the phrase of like a turning towards, my heart turning towards God, and
Mhm.
giving him his due praise, giving him his due recognition that he is present, that he's here in my life. And, I think all of us, I'm sure, have been on the journey of knowing that worship is so much deeper than our feelings and our emotions. Um, and I'm somebody that responds to feelings and emotions, and for sure have been on a journey for a while of, you know what, Ruth, like in all circumstances, I worship, because in all circumstances, it is possible for me to choose to turn my heart towards him, and to turn my response towards him, and acknowledge his presence, and acknowledge his greatness, that he is above, this situation, he's above this circumstance, and that he's above my emotions and my feelings and my responses to whatever might be going on. So I think like that's been a journey for me of, yeah, that turning towards God, turning
Turning
my
towards
heart
God.
towards him. For me, that's how I would sum up worship, for me anyway, at the moment. It sounds a bit
Brilliant.
individualistic, but
That sounds really good. I mean, if your family is anything like mine, there are times where it's really hard to worship.
yeah,
It is hard to
yeah,
turn toward God when you're in the middle of
yeah,
a battle,
yeah,
whatever that battle may be. And for me, whichever girl that may be with, thinking about turning toward God isn't normally where I'd be at. I
yeah,
eventually get there, but in the
yeah,
middle of it, that's really,
yeah.
really hard.
Yeah, and I think, before we moved to Rwanda, we lived in France, and we were part of a small church plant, a small house church in France. Paul was pretty much the only like worship leader. Our kids were younger and smaller. Sophie was a baby, and like Sunday mornings looked so different for us. Sunday mornings, it was gathering in a living room. My husband's like playing the guitar and leading worship, and I'm managing like small kids.
Yeah.
And it was such a contrast for me, for the Sunday morning worship experience I had had before. And I realized quite quickly, like you're expressing, Earl, that like I had to figure out how to engage with God. And I remember so clearly, like just sweeping the floor one day, and it was one of those moments where I was frustrated and irritated, and I knew in that moment I had a choice, like, but it was that turning towards, like that turning my heart towards God in that very mundane activity of like again sweeping the floor. And he spoke, and he brought the word I needed to hear. And just other times and other moments of that I've had, yeah, where it's like it's so possible, hey, isn't it, to meet with God in all circumstances, and yeah, and worship him in that turning towards him.
Yeah, so using that turning towards as a definition, this chapter then carries on. And like you said, it's focused at first at the people of God, and then it's saying that the nations worship the Lord in splendor of his holiness, tremble before him all the earth, and the nations
Mm,
will turn towards him.
mm, mm,
And then it morphs into, after verse 10, into verse 11 and 12, where we want to hone in here, where
mhm,
it's not the nations and it's not the people, but actually it's the whole of creation
mm,
turning
mm.
toward him. So you were referencing earlier in our conversation, before we were on the video, looking at this from the message. I wonder if you could read 11 and 12 from the message version for us, and then just share your thoughts on that, because it's
Yeah,
really, really creative.
okay. Yeah, so 11 and 12 in the message says, let's hear it from the sky, with earth joining in, and a huge round of applause from the sea. Let wilderness turn cartwheels, animals come dance, put every tree of the forest in the choir. And I'm going to go on to 13 actually,
Yeah,
to an extravaganza before God as he comes to set everything right on earth, set everything right, treat everyone fair. Yeah, so
that's cool.
sorry, do you want me to just leap in?
Yeah, yeah. So what do you
You can
think
ask
about
me.
that?
Yeah.
11 and
Yeah,
12,
so
and certainly 13 as well.
yeah, so I was saying, For me, it's the sense, like, as we get to the very end of the psalm, and we've seen it like before, the sense from verse 10, we see it too, of justice, um of God, yeah, God bringing justice, of God treating people, like bringing things right, and restoring justice. And I think just thinking about, what does it mean? Like, what does it look like for the earth to worship? And we see it in scripture, don't we? We see it through the Psalms, of the earth responding, the earth worshiping God. And I've just been thinking recently about our connect, like as people, as mankind, like our relationship with the earth and our connection with the earth. And it's so easy, like in the UK or when we visit Canada, to feel pretty separate from the earth, from the ground,
Yeah,
because we buy our food from the supermarket shelves, and sometimes it's wrapped up and it's ready, like, to eat. It's pretty, the steps of from the earth to my table are many, but I am far from that. And then contrasting that really to what I see in our everyday life here in Rwanda, of people working the earth, like 70-75% of the population rely on growing food and the
right. Okay.
subsistence farmers, and they work the land. You see them hoeing and preparing the earth. You hear them talking about the rain. What's the rain doing? When's it going to come? How heavy is it going to come? When's the harvest coming? Prices increase in dry season because we're not growing enough food. So for
Hmm.
Rwandans and the culture that we're currently in, like, people are connected to the earth. Their relationship with the earth it's right there, because if they don't grow enough food, then they don't sell the produce, or they don't get to feed their family. Yet for me in the West, my relationship with the earth is so kind of removed and disconnected. And yeah, just how, for me, that feeds into the issue then of creation care, feeds into the question, like, of climate justice, because it's an issue of justice, because it's the poorer nations that are suffering, from drought or from floods, like we see on the news, we've seen in
Yeah, yeah,
Pakistan. And it's often the nations and the people who actually have that connection with the earth that are at the forefront of the negative effects, of the change in climate. And so what does it look like for me to worship God? What does it look like for me to worship God through caring for his creation, through how I look after the earth, through what I eat, through being responsible? And I don't have the answers, really, just a lot of questions, of really, yeah, that question, Earl, of what does it look like for me, for my family, to worship God through caring for his creation, that we see, like, we see its response, right? We see the earth worshiping God.
and it's a big question, and it's not one that's going to go away. It's only going to
Mm-mm-mm.
get bigger. It's only going to get more wider, I suppose,
Yeah.
or everyone's going to be facing that question as time goes on. It's
Yeah.
really interesting here in this passage, David again writing using this terminology about the earth. Everybody at that time would have totally gotten that because they all worked the
Mm,
earth. It was an agrarian society, probably much like where you are now compared to
mm,
where I am and where most of the people watching this video. We pop to the shop and get whatever it may be already packaged, shipped from somewhere else in the world, most likely.
mm.
So it does make you think a lot more.
Yeah.
So this, as we come in for a landing here, this chapter really mostly about, well, it's all about worship in a different way for the people, for the world, or the nations of the world, and then for the earth itself.
Mm,
And you would summarize, and I love the summary of turning toward Him, turning your face toward the Lord, whatever situation that may be in. That to me is the big takeaway
Mm,
from this chapter and from what you've had to share, and also the challenge there that we see at the end. So
mm, mm.
thanks a lot for coming along on the path this week, Ruth.
Ah, thanks for having me.
Been
To
been
see you
really
again.
cool. And for those of you that are finishing the video up, carry on reading a little bit, and then you'll have another song before we finish with a prayer. So we'll sign off for now from Rwanda, and talk to you again another time.